Come along with me in this Luminar Neo photo editing tutorial where we transform this portrait and turn it into this. Not only am I going to cover the basic and fundamental portrait tools inside of Luminar Neo, but we'll also take things just that little bit further, and I'll show you some more unique tips and tricks that you guys can apply to your portraits as well. If you've joined my channel with the membership plus downloads option, I'll put this photo into our shared folder so you guys can follow along and try these techniques as well. Right, let's get into Neo. We're going to work on this bridal portrait here, but the techniques will be applicable to any portrait. She's lit from light coming from a window on her left hand side, but as you can see it's brighter at the bottom half of her body than it is at the top. So although if we look at our histogram it looks like it's a pretty well exposed photo, in fact we have a difference of exposure. We have a brighter bottom half than we do at the top. So I want to even that out. Another issue that I've got is she had such a beautiful dress, however it's actually hard to see a lot of the details that we have going on here. So I'd like to bring out those details. And a good way to do that would be to jump into the Develop Raw tool and just drop the highlights down. And we could also apply some structure as well and then just mask that into that area. However, I don't want to do any of that. I'm going to jump back into the catalog and I'm just going to drag the photo into the HDR Merge tool. And I'm just going to click Merge. So the HDR Merge tool has created this version for us, which really doesn't look good in terms of a portrait. However, look at all the detail that's being brought back into the dress, even the chair and maybe her hair as well. So what I'm going to do is open up our original again, and I'm going to introduce the merged HDR version as a new layer. So I'll just come over to the layers section, click the plus icon, and within the pictures folder on Windows, you have the HDR Merge folder, and there is our bride right there. So we're just going to click on that. And now Luminar has dropped that HDR version in as a new layer over the top of our original. We're currently at 50%. I can push that all the way to 100 so we just see the HDR version, and I can drop it away so we see our original. It's a big difference, but what I want to do is steal elements from this HDR version. I'm only interested in enhancements to the portrait, not to the background. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just use the portrait background removal tool and just click remove. Now I'm going to jump back into the mask and come into my brush mode so that I can erase other areas I don't want. So my eraser is currently sat at 50%, so I'm just going to start taking this away from other areas. And now I can push my strength to 100 and just ensure that I'm not increasing any of that sort of HDR detail into her skin. Okay, let's toggle the layer off and on just so we can see how we're looking. So this is the layer hidden. This is with it reintroduced. So our before and our after. Not too bad, but it's a little over the top at the moment. So I'm just going to erase the effect a little more from certain areas, like around the back of her hair where she's getting a little bit of haloing going on. Again, let's have a little toggle of our before and our after. So this is without the HDR layer, and this is with it. Okay, looking pretty good. What I'm going to do now is just jump back to the original layer quickly, and I'm just going to make some adjustments. So I'm going to come into the Develop Raw section, and I'm going to come down to the Camera Neutral option. You've got Camera Portrait here, which would certainly be a good option. However, Camera Neutral just gives you a little bit more latitude for pushing your file around. So I'm going to give the file just a little bit of an exposure bump. Make sure we're controlling the highlights, and let's just see what the shadows would do. Okay, no, I don't want to push too much of that in. A little is okay. And now I'm going to move the whites and the black point. So when I'm doing this, I like to press the J key just to get a warning, a clipping warning as to where we're blowing out details. And although it looks like we're losing detail around her hip area, we're actually not, because we're actually recovering it by introducing this HDR layer. So now the overall exposure is pretty good. What I'd like to do is just darken down this bottom half, more so in the bottom left hand corner. So a nice darkened gradient dropping off across the photo would be the way to go here. So what I'd like to do is access another Develop tool right now so that I can change the exposure. However, because I haven't applied any other tool, I still have access to that Develop Raw tool. So as soon as I've come in and made any change to another tool, all of a sudden that Develop Raw tool is going to drop into our Edit section only. And now I have the ability to come in and have a brand new instance of the Develop tool, and now I can come in and make some other changes. So I'm just going to darken down the highlights, darken down the exposure, and I'm just going to be applying that in here and tapering it off. So I'll jump into the masking section, grab a linear gradient, and say give me 100% of that effect down in the bottom left and taper it off up here. Let's drag that down a little bit. Let's have a look. Okay, not too bad. Here's our before, here's our after. So we started here, much brighter in the bottom half, dark in the top, and now this is where we're at with a more even exposure and a lot more detail in the dress. Now I quite like that technique of combining the best of an HDR merged file with the original and just stealing the best bits of both. However, there's one drawback at the moment that I hope Luminar fixes soon, and that is actually merging them down into one single layer so that any subsequent editing that we apply will affect the whole photo, whereas currently any editing tools that I apply will only affect the layer that I'm on. So what we need to do is export this as a really high quality file, so a nice 16-bit TIFF would be the way to go, and then we'll continue our edit on that. So I'm going to right click and come to export. I'll call that wedding portrait base. Make sure I've got a nice 16-bit TIFF file, so a really lovely rich file in the Adobe RGB color space. Hit export, and now I can come to my catalog, open up that file, come to edit. So now we've got those initial changes we made plus the two layers merged into one for us to carry on our edit. Let's do this. I've collapsed all the tool panels down here so that we can just focus on the portrait tools here. So portrait bokeh AI, that's for blur in the background. We've got face AI and skin AI, which are going to be pretty helpful to us, and also body AI. Personally, I don't really use the body reshaping tool here. I like to just focus on these two instead. I say that and then go and apply the tool, so we'll just reset that, and let's come into face AI and focus on that instead. So the first tool we have is face light. So anywhere that you brighten in an image, it's going to draw attention to it. So having this ability to brighten the face is a good thing. However, we don't want to overcook it. Just like any tool in Luminar Neo, 100% is usually far too much. So we want to just sort of tickle a little bit of this in. We have the option to slim the face down as well, but just like changing our subject's body, I'm not really a big fan of changing the actual geometry of somebody's face. So I'm going to leave that exactly as it is. Just so we can see these effects a little better, I am going to zoom in. And now we're moving on to the section about eyes. I think it's pretty obvious that we can see her eye over this side is open wider than this eye, and we can use this tool to correct for that. But before I go making any corrections to just one eye, what I'm going to need to do is actually mask it in. So I don't want to be changing the mask of the face light. I still want that applied to the whole face. So what I'm going to do is close this tool down. That's going to apply that face light, and now I can open up another brand new instance of face AI. And now I can come in and grab the enlarge eyes slider and just start increasing the size of the eye. And all I'm worried about is making the eye on this side match the one on the left as we're looking at it. However, I've increased the size of this one as well, and we don't want that, but that's okay. We're going to mask the eye in. So I'm coming over here, I'm going to grab the brush tool. I want the strength set to 100. And I'm currently not painting the mask in, I'm erasing it, so I've done the opposite of what I want, but that's okay. I can just come to the mask actions and I'm going to invert the mask so I get the opposite of what I just created. So here we go, before and after. They actually look like they're matching in size now, so before and after. And when I flick back to the original, it really looks like her eye is reduced in size, so this is a much better match. And now I'm going to close that down because I want another new instance, because now any changes I make, I don't want it applied only to this eye, I want it applied to both eyes. So let's see what we can do. Eye whitening, should we boost that up? Yeah, that looks beautiful and natural. No, it doesn't. We never want to go that far with our eye whitening, but a little bit again, a little bit can help us out. The eye enhancer can be useful, but I'm not going to use it in this case because as I boost this up, you can actually see that the two eyes again look different, and that is purely because there was more light hitting this side of her face. This pupil is actually in shadow, and so I could work on the masks again and work on them separately, but we're going to address that with a different technique with a little bit more control. We have the dark circles removal slider, which brightens up underneath the eye, but to be honest, this bride looks pretty well rested, so I won't even worry about that. And the Improve Eyebrows slider, which I always find a curious name because whether or not they are improved is purely a matter of opinion. Basically, it's a darkening of the eyebrows, so maybe darken eyebrows would have been a better name for it. But look, she's got dark hair, so pushing a little bit more black into those hairs, that's fine. Let's have a little look at our before and our after. Pretty subtle, and that's the key. You want to keep these changes pretty subtle. After we've dealt with the eyes, we can come and have a look at dealing with the lips. So you can do things like increase the saturation, we can make the lips redder if we want to, and we can also darken the lips as well. If she was smiling, the AI would recognize that she's got teeth in there and would whiten those teeth, but obviously no teeth to whiten. Purely for the sake of doing something with the tool, I am going to push a little bit of color in there. And again, here's our before, here's our after. Now let's open up the skin AI and see what that can do. I'm going to grab the amount slider and just push that all the way to 100 just so we can see what's going on. Here's our before and here's our after. You can see how that's cleaned up the skin really nicely. It's also intelligently only applying that effect to the skin only. It's not like we've got to come and mask it out from other places. However, a mask can be useful so that we can control how much of that effect is being applied to different areas. So for example, I may want to put more of this effect on her forehead and clean that up, and less of it on the cheeks and other areas just to keep it more realistic. We also have this shine removal slider as well, and if I push that up, you're going to see that those white highlights that we had on the left hand side of the face before and after, they've been neutralized. So that's quite a useful slider as well. If someone has sweaty skin, shiny skin, you know, you can push that up and that's going to get rid of it. In this case, I don't want to apply too much of that. I like the fact that she's got highlights on this side of the face, gives it that nice sense of three-dimensional form, but I am definitely wanting to use some of this skin softening. So I am going to mask this in. I'm going to start with a brush, probably a strength around 50% would be a good starting point. And now I can click and just start painting this over. I'm going to change the size of my brush using the bracket keys. Left bracket key is just going to reduce the size slightly. And now because I have this set at 50%, I can actually build the effect up stronger in certain areas. So as I said, on the forehead, and now I've got less of the effect on her cheeks and around her chin. So here's our before, here's our after. Before and after. I may even remove it from underneath her nose because I just want to keep that definition there. Now we've zoomed into her face so we won't see the rest of the body. However, trust me, the skin AI will have been applied all over here, but currently we've masked it out. So I am going to come into the brush, come into paint mode, and I will just put a little bit over her body here, over her arms and down there. Okay, so here's our before, here's our after. So when you're working with portraits, that skin AI tool is really great for retouching. You know, one slider and you're done. You can mask it in more or less in certain areas. And if someone's got particularly bad skin, you can use a second application of the same tool. You can use the mask to control how much extra of that you want to put in certain areas. So it's actually a very effective tool. Now underneath the two sliders, there's a skin defects removal AI checkbox. And the idea behind that is you tick that if someone has spots and pimples and things like that, and it will clean those up. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes not so much. Now I'm going to show you how you can use the clone tool to clean things up if for some reason that doesn't work for you. So we'll take a quick look at that. So if we zoom into 200% and we take a look at her arm here. If we come over, we can click the Skin Defects Removal AI, and you might think, well, why hasn't it got rid of this or the mole here? You know, so it's a bit hit and miss, to be honest. So if you do have particular areas you want to come in and clean up, I would come down to the clone tool. Then all you need to do is select an area of skin that's the same color and tone, and then you can borrow from that area and paint it over the top. So I'm going to do a bit of skin retouching here, just using this technique. I wouldn't actually recommend that you come in and get rid of people's permanent marks, such as moles. However, I'm just doing this purely for demonstration purposes. Another technique we can do, as I close that down and open up a brand new instance, is to borrow from one area to soften another. So you don't want to do this with the strength set to 100%. So I'm going to drop that all the way down. Let's have about 10%. And I'm going to borrow from her cheek here because I've just clicked there, and if you're not happy with the source, just hold the Alt key down and you can click somewhere else. But I'm looking for a color tone that's sort of the same here as where I want to paint where we've got an area on her face that potentially could benefit from just having a little bit of softening done. So I'm literally just borrowed from the cheek there. I'm going to go again. It's going to be hard to see because I'm building this up, as you know, with just 10%. She's a beautiful lady and I really don't need to be doing much in the way of retouching. Like I say, purely for demonstration purposes. Let's have a little look at our before and our after of that retouch in that little area. Here's our before, here's our after. Another thing we could try to get the irises in the eyes to match a little better is to actually sample from one and start painting it over the other. Now I don't want to do this too heavy-handedly. I'm just going to put the strength, let's say 34%, so we can see what we're doing, and I'm going to match this up. So I've clicked on the pupil area there, so I'm going to match that up by clicking on the pupil here, and now I'm just going to start painting, and we're probably going to be borrowing a little bit of that colour from the one on the left to paint to the right. So let's have a little look. Here's our before, here's our after. Before and after. Now, being zoomed in this close, I'm a little frustrated to see that the portrait is actually a little soft, and particularly around the eyes, you always want to have a real nice sharpness to your image. So let's see what we can do in Luminar Neo just to correct for my mistake on site. So I'm going to close the clone tool down and let's jump back into the Essentials tab, and within here we have access to the Details tab here. And let's just go through cranking these up and seeing what happens. So her skin starts to fall apart here, but perhaps there's some good details going on in the lips and maybe a little bit around the edge of the eyes as well. What about the medium details? Let's see what that does. Okay, I prefer that effect, and it's been a lot more respectful of her skin as well. Let's double click to reset that. And now let's grab the large details and boost that up and have a look as well. Okay, not too bad. Let's go for a bit of the large details and let's crank the medium details back up as well. Okay, let's grab the sharpen slider and bump that bad boy up. As I push that to 100, it's actually harder to see what's going on there because it's being overpowered by the medium and the large details as well. But one thing we can do is actually come into the sharpening masking, and that's going to allow us to actually increase the radius. And as soon as I do that, we start to see what's going on there, and wow, far too much, as you can see. But look, I'm going to boost the radius just a bit, bring the sharpening down, and I just want to toggle before and after. And yes, absolutely, this effect is way too much. However, we have access to our mask, so we can just apply a little bit of it or however much we want, and only in the area we want to. So I'm going to bring the strength down to about 1/3. I'm going to use my left bracket key just to reduce the size of the brush, and I'm going to start by painting in the eyes, just so that I'm starting to introduce a little bit more pop and clarity to the eyes. I'm going to go over the eyebrows as well, and particularly over her eyelashes. Maybe a pass just underneath the bottom of her nose to bring out some details there. And I quite liked what was going on with her lips as well. Now the eye on this side is sharper than this eye, so I'm actually going to go for another pass on this eye to try and balance it out. And now if we toggle our before and after, we can see that we're certainly introducing more sharpness in those areas. And if you feel like you've gone overboard, which I do just a little bit, I'm going to come in with the erase mode. And if you want to just flick between the two of those, paint and erase, you can just press X on your keyboard. And I'm just going to reduce it from the lips a little bit. I think that was just a little bit heavy-handed. Okay, here's our before, here's our after. We could also put just a little bit in the hair as well, just to bring out a little more detail in the strands. Let's have a little look. Here's our before, here's our after, before and after. Nice bit of differentiation there. Okay, let's come to the preview tool at 100% and see our before and after. You can see how the skin's getting cleaned up. You can see how we've matched the size of the eyes, and we've also brought in a little bit of sharpness as well. So overall, in terms of a retouch on a portrait, I don't think I'd really want to do too much more than that. So anything I do beyond that will be more about the global editing of the photo as a whole. So let's see if we can't just put some finishing touches on this and then we'll call it done. The next thing I want to do is try and accentuate the three-dimensional feel of this 2D photo. So I'm going to come up to the Develop tab here, and what I want to do is just brighten the left-hand side of her body whilst keeping that right-hand side that's more in shade unaffected. So what I'm going to do is grab the exposure slider and just give that a bit of a bump. Don't want to go too high. I might just protect the highlights a little bit, just so we're not getting bleached out. And now I'm going to grab the shadow slider and bring that down, because that's just going to help control this side of her face. Something like that will do. Now I'm not going to be applying this to the whole photo. I just want to be putting it on this side where the light's hitting. So to give me a kickstarter, I'm going to use Luminar's AI masking just to select her only. So I just need to click on human. And while it's not perfect, it's given us a pretty good starting point. And now I can come in with my brush, erase, take that effect off from where the chair is for a start. Now let's just have a little toggle of this effect as we've masked it in. So this is our before and this is our after. We're certainly getting brighter there, but I don't really want to affect the whole of her body here. So what I'm going to do is just erase it from this side of her body. Wherever there's sort of shade and shadow, I'm just going to take this effect away. And we can use pretty much the same technique for darkening down this side, again enhancing that sense of three-dimensionality. So I'm going to come in and this time I'm going to grab the exposure slider and bring that down. And these adjustments that I've made here, while I'm looking at the photo as an overall, I know that I'm only going to be applying these into the shadows and where I paint it back in. So again, I'm going to jump into our mask AI. It's already all there for us from before, so no extra computation. But all we need to do now is just erase this effect from where we don't want it, which is the bright side of the model. And if you make a mistake anywhere, you can just press Ctrl-Z on your keyboard to get rid of that last stroke. So here's our before, and here's the introduction of that shadow. So before and after. And I may just reduce that effect off of her actual dress because I want to keep that nice and bright. And just as one final touch to help control the viewer's eye, I'm just going to create a kind of fake vignette. So rather than putting the oval vignette on, I'm actually going to create my own look. So basically wherever I paint, I'm going to be applying what I'm creating here. It is starting to add a little bit of extra saturation as I'm pulling away the highlights. So what I want to do is just come down and balance it out by grabbing the saturation slider and just reducing that so that the colors when I paint this in aren't really affected. So now again, I'm going to grab my mask, I'm going to come in and this time I'm going to have a linear gradient because I want to darken down in that bottom left hand corner here and have that fading off up here. So let's come out of that and see what that's done. So before and after. Before and after, and now I'm going to grab my brush as well with a strength of about 50 is fine. I'm currently in the erase mode, so I will press X on my keyboard just to switch it over, and now I'm just painting my own vignette around this photo. And then if it's gone over areas of her that I don't want it to, like it's muddying the dress a little bit, I can just come in with the erase tool and just make sure that that's not affecting her. So here's our before and here's our after, a custom vignette. As a final touch, I just want to crop the image because I feel it's a little heavy on the right hand side. Yes, I want her looking off into negative space. I just feel that there's just a bit too much empty space over this side. So I'm just going to grab that and bring it in. Something like that will be fine. Give her a bit of breathing space above the top of her head, and I also didn't want to cut into just this little shape that we had going on with the dress here. We've come a long way with this portrait edit, so let's look at our before and here's our after. This is where we started with that base layer made up of the original plus the HDR merge, and this is where we got to. Let's have a little zoom into her face and look at our before and after, before and after. Back in the day when I used to shoot weddings, a lot of the brides would ask me for a more vintage kind of feel to their photos. So let me show you how I would achieve that very quickly with one tool. I'm going to open up the develop tool so that we can access curves. And what I'm going to do is grab the bottom point and just start lifting that up. And as I raise that up, it's raising the tonal value of the blacks and the shadows. By the same token, if I grab the top right and start bringing that down, it's doing the opposite effect. It's grabbing the highlights and bringing out the whites from the highlights. So by using this knowledge, we can create our own faded look. So all we've done is move those 2 points. And if we have a quick look at the before and after, you can see that we've already faded that image out. But as a consequence of fading an image, you can sometimes lose a bit of contrast, and I like contrast. So what I'm going to do is introduce the classic S-curve into what we've already faded out. So we don't really have to lose contrast as such, but we can get the best of both worlds. I don't need to be too aggressive with it, something like that. Let's have a look at our before and our after. And another brilliant thing with the curves tool is we can come into the individual color channels. So I've come into the blue here, and we can actually inject blue into the shadows or the highlights, or what we can do is kind of balance the two out by bringing blue out of the highlights, while at the same time we've pushed a little into the shadows. And as a final touch for that faded vintage look, what I like to do is just come to the saturation slider and just reduce that ever so slightly. It just helps with that nice soft feel. And I'm just going to boost the temperature up 1, because by reducing the saturation, things can look a little cool sometimes, and I just want to keep the portrait looking nice and warm. So here's our before. This is our corrected base layer combined with that HDR merge, and then this is our finished edit. So this was our before, and this is after. I've decided I'm not super in love with that color grade, but I like a little bit of it. So what I'm going to do is actually have 50% of that effect. And a pretty easy way to do that is just to grab your mask with your strength set at 50% and just go over the entire photo. And now we've got 50% of that effect that we just created. So it's a little bit of that color grading, but not too much. We've covered a lot in this portrait editing tutorial, but I couldn't cover everything. And there is one technique that is the absolute Daddymac when it comes to working with portraits, and that is the dodge and burn technique. And if you want to learn how to do that, I'll cover that in this video right here. We'll create a beautiful black and white portrait, and we'll learn the dodge and burn technique along the way. I'll see you in that video.